Welcome everybody. As people are continuing to join us, I'm very excited to have William here as part of our webinar series. So we've been doing quite a few webinars since we can't go anywhere these days, but thank you for joining us. And so I asked William if he would join us tonight to talk about syntax, and we're very excited to have him. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we've got coming up, and then I'll introduce William while I just kind of stall a little bit till we get closer to our registration numbers as they keep coming on in. We have a webinar series that we've been doing for the last several weeks, and we're going to continue on into the next month on different things. We'll have spelling rules. We're doing a couple little fundraising, we call them clicks because it's Kendore Learning Community. Not because they are exclusive clicks, but just because that was cute when we're called Kendore Learning. Everybody is welcome. And I always wanted to be part of a click, so I just made my own. So if you are interested, you can check out our website for those coming up. The ones that are the clicks are, we are have a nonprofit that raises money to serve kids that cannot afford or do not have access to OG tutoring. So it is a fundraiser for that. We also fundraise for teacher training in areas that that also do not have funding for that because we are an accredited orton-gillingham provider through IDA and MSLIC. So let's get started. William, I've known William for a very long time, but I'm going to read his biography right here. So William Van Cleave is in private practice as an educational consultant whose specialties include morphology and written expression, an internationally recognized speaker with an interactive hands-on presentation style. William has presented on effective teaching practices at conferences and schools both in the United States and abroad since 1995. Recent projects include consulting with 3 schools as part of a literacy grant in Montana, participating on the MTSS Writing Standards Committee for the state of Pennsylvania, implementing several trainer of trainers projects using the sentence structure approach, and writing a companion book on developing composition skills to complement his sentence approach. So many big words, William. The author of 3 books, including Writing Matters and Everything You Want to Know and Exactly Where to Find It, as well as a number of educational tools and activities. William has served as a classroom teacher, tutor, and administrator in the private school arena at various points in his career. And we are so happy to have you here. And I am going to step aside. I'll just keep an eye on the questions, and around 8 o'clock, we will stop and answer some. Sound good?
Terrific. Yep, I'm taking the screen right now. You all give us 10 seconds to do this tech piece, and I think we're going to be good to go. We practiced it earlier, so we'd be ready. All right, so welcome. I did see one question before I moved the questions out of the way, and I thought I would say, I was going to say this at the end, but I think I'll say it at the beginning so that people won't be nervous. Tomorrow in your emails, you should receive a PDF of the slides, and you can have that for your reference later on. And I did see that question right as I was signing in and moving the questions aside. So first of all, let me say that I'm really, Jennifer and I have known each other for a very long time. You know, since we're both in our early 30s, you know, it hasn't been as long as you might think, but very long time. And I'm very appreciative of her invitation to come and share with you guys through Kendore. And I'm going to do my favorite topic, and I'm going to be honest with you guys and tell you that syntax at 7 p.m. is not the easiest thing, so you have to kind of bear with me. I will make it as fun and interactive as I can, but I always tell consultants and coaches and administrators when I come in that I would prefer to do syntax before lunch, and this is likely to be after cocktails and dinner, so we'll see how it goes. So this is my favorite topic, and I think one of the reasons I'm so excited about this topic is that it is a topic that not a lot of people present on, not a lot of people share ideas on, but I think most people recognize the importance of. So I like to be able to go out and share things with people that everybody isn't doing, and really sort of get into a specialty or an area where I'm super comfortable, and I think it has such a powerful impact. So let me see how this goes. Good. So I am moving pretty quickly right now away from the term grammar and moving towards the term syntax. So I'm using grammar less and less as a term, and I'm using syntax more and more. And probably the biggest reason is because when we use the term grammar, we could mean two different things. So one, grammar is the kind of prescriptive labeling, underlining, circling, coding that some of us might have been asked to do in grammar school. And one, grammar is a term we use to talk about the overarching system of the English language, the grammar of English or the grammar of Spanish, etc. So I think when I've got a term where when I say it, you could misunderstand me, I'm not too keen on using that term. So I've really been moving towards syntax. And I think syntax brings in some of the importance of the system that we're going to talk about tonight. So if the grammar of a language is its system and structure, it makes sense today to focus on syntax, which is a key component of that grammar. And syntax is the arrangement of words and phrases to create well-formed sentences. So if you want a short kind of nugget of that, basically it's word order. So syntax is why Yoda, for example, sounds cool. He varies or he shifts his word order, but it's not so off of English syntax that we don't understand him. It's just varied, makes him sound a little sophisticated, makes him sound like he's from another culture. So we need a vocabulary to discuss syntax. In other words, we use terminology to facilitate our work in writing and reading. So we don't want to learn terms in and of themselves just to know them. What we want to do instead is learn those terms so that we have a vocabulary to discuss the way sentences work, the way writing sentences works, and the way reading and understanding those sentences also works. So the order and grouping of words within a language system allows us to understand relationships among the ideas, such as subject-verb-object relationships. And this is Louisa Moats from the 3rd edition of Speech to Print, which just came out actually last month. So I actually love this. This is kind of a witty piece, but basically I did not create this, but I've never been able to see anybody take credit for it either. So I can't really attribute it to anybody. But if you look at these sentences, the only change, the only shift is the word only and the location. And what happens when you move that word around is that the comprehension, the meaning of that sentence changes a lot. And that really kind of hits home my message about syntax. So I'm just going to read a couple of them for you. The first one says, she told him she loved him only. And the second one says, she told him she loved only him. And then the third one, though, is a bit different. It says she told him she only loved him. There were other people that she knew and cared about, but he was the only one she loved. If you look at the bottom one, she only told him she loved him. And I think that's probably the funniest because it suggests that she's dating several people, but there was only one that she chose to tell that she loved him. So again, it's just the shifting of this single word only, and yet the content, the comprehension of the sentence shifts radically. All right, so there are kind of two grammar camps functioning right now in the world at large. Camp 1 says learning terminology and identifying and labeling parts of speech and sentence parts is a necessary component of ELA and makes better writers. In other words, teach grammar in isolation, in a vacuum. And Camp 2 says explicit grammar instruction is useless as an activity. Useless as an activity, wastes valuable time, and makes students hate writing. Teach grammar incidentally as problems arise in student writing. And let me give you an example of that. I think number 1 is pretty clear what that might look like, but Camp 2 is a little bit different. So Camp 2 might be, I have assigned some papers and the students submit them, and I read them and I kind of assess for strengths and weaknesses. And I discovered that 3 or 4 children are having difficulty in their writing because they're writing a lot of short, choppy sentences. So I pull them aside as a group and I do a little mini lesson. And in that mini lesson, I do some sentence combining to help them combine some of these short, choppy sentences and to make those sentences, flow better, etc. So that would be kind of number 2, the incidental coverage. I notice a problem, I notice a difficulty, I address it, and I sort of apply a remedy to it, and we do that in a little mini lesson format. So that's kind of Camp 2. Okay, so we've got some problems with both of these camps. Camp 1 says, learning terminology and identifying and labeling parts of speech and sentence parts is a necessary component. So we're going to do that coding, that labeling, that underlining, that circling. We've got 2 real problems with that. Those are the lightning bolts on the slide. So the first problem is that decades of research, actually decades, and we may even be up to half a century now, decades of research indicates that isolated grammar instruction does not improve writing. And the second problem with this is that typically when grammar is taught this way, students learn to fear or loathe it. And one of the saddest things for me is students who, when you say something about sentence structure or syntax or grammar, they groan or they moan and they say, do we have to? Can we do something else? What have you? And I think there's a way to do this that's not only meaningful, but also interactive and engaging. And that's not going to be, underlining nouns in a 50-page packet. So. Camp 2, remember, is our incidental coverage one. So the example I gave you was the short, choppy sentences and people needing to sort of do sentence combining. There are a couple of problems with this. First, when you teach syntax or anything really in this way, you don't provide a framework so that they understand where the concept you're teaching fits into an overall big picture of writing or reading or whatever the concept might be. So it would be like, sort of like teaching A, but not explaining that A is one of the vowels and that vowels are different from consonants and what have you, just teaching it as this vacuum kind of concept. Also, a second lightning bolt, there's really not enough practice to internalize concepts. So one of the things the research tells us is that strugglers often need multiple repetitions to get a concept in. And when you do things in mini lesson format where you just have that kind of incidental coverage and you address a problem and then you move on, there's really no evidence that they will then take what you have done with them and apply it the next time they write. They're not going to naturally, inherently write more sophisticated sentences when they go to write the next time. Also, one of the problems is that we really haven't made a link when we do these incidental coverage pieces between writing and reading comprehension. And one of the most fascinating and important pieces of syntax instruction is this really powerful connection we have between sentence writing and sentence understanding. Also, we really don't have a development of a common vocabulary or language to talk about sentence structure. So just to give you an example, there's this 4-legged object that sits in most of your houses, and on that object you put things. You might put food, or you might put a computer, or maybe you put some books or plants or something, and that thing is called a table. And the reason that we have the term table is to facilitate a conversation about the table, so that every time we mention it, we don't have to say that 4-legged object where we put things, et cetera, et cetera. So this syntax piece, if we keep our eye on the ball, the terminology, the language of syntax, that is a powerful tool to communicate about the reading and the writing of these sentence level pieces. All right, so I have developed a Camp 3, and Camp 3 is extraordinary. It has better features, and this is the camp we're going to use going forward. So syntax instruction can be both effective and engaging. First, we're going to use the language of syntax to facilitate better writing and reading. Second, we're going to teach concepts using a logical sequential approach. So I really don't have any problem with the mini lesson where we work on sentence combining. I think that's a great activity, but it's got to be grounded in a framework so that students understand where that instruction fits in their overall thinking about the language. The third point is that we're going to avoid rote memorization and excessive labeling activities. And rote memorization may be new to some of you. I didn't make a typo. This isn't W-R-O-T-E. This is rote, R-O-T-E. And rote memorization is the memorization of meaningless, disconnected facts. So I'll give you a good example. A good example is we need to memorize multiplication facts so that algebra is easy and comfortable for them. So if we're trying to punch numbers in using a calculator when we do algebra, it's extremely tedious, extremely time consuming. So that rote memorization is good. I'll give you rote memory that I'm not sure we have a use for, though some of you might disagree. Memorizing the 50 state capitals seems to me to be rote memorizing that really doesn't have a lot of use. I think that we should know our own state capital, and that might be enough for what we're doing and what we need educationally and in life. So again, rote memory, the memorization of meaningless, disconnected facts. What we're going to do is avoid memorizing lists of words and things like that as we move forward. And finally, we're going to create reinforcement activities that engage students in genuine reading comprehension and writing practice. So one of the things I want you to do when you're instructing students in writing is to ask yourself, does this make my student a better writer or a better comprehender of somebody else's writing? And if it doesn't, if you really can't figure out why it would be of benefit, then ask yourself why you're doing it. Second guess yourself a little bit and maybe use that time more productively in a different way. So if a concept does not improve student reading and or writing, just plain don't teach it. All right, a couple of things the research tells us. One, sentence combining has a strong positive effect on writing. We have a lot of research on this. If you're not doing sentence combining and you're doing written expression work, you probably want to be doing that sentence combining piece. Also, recent research indicates that grammar taught as it applies to writing has a strong positive effect on writing. So if you can make that connection between the grammar, the syntax of the language, that direct explicit instruction, and applied activities in writing, you're going to get game-changing results. And finally, syntax study can improve reading comprehension at the sentence level. And towards the end of the workshop, I'm going to show you a more complicated sentence and really talk to you a little bit about how that works. It is not enough to teach the grammatical system. If this teaching is to affect writing, then it must be explicitly applied to writing. So we've got two major concepts to try to work with tonight. One is parts of speech, and the other is the sentence parts. And the parts of speech component, which is where we're headed next, is all about the job, the function, or the role. I always tell students, don't ask what a word is, ask what a word does. And I think that's going to be really key to our thinking about this. Focus students' attention on the role a word plays or the job a word has in a sentence. Using parts of speech this way builds student writing and reading comprehending because it builds in students the ability to understand the way words relate to one another to convey meaning. So I've actually got a little activity for you guys, and I'd like you to take, I don't know, 60 seconds. I'm actually going to give you that time. And jot down what part of speech you think these 4 words might be. Just jot them down on a napkin or in your phone or something. And we're going to come back to this in about, I don't know, 30, 45 seconds now. Take a minute. All right, so we're in kind of an interesting spot with this, and I love doing this with kids because you'll get a great connect with kids, and there will be light bulbs that go off. You can actually see in their faces. That's some of the best teaching. It's a really awesome experience when you see those light bulbs. So I'm not going to read all of these. I'm just going to take the first one and the third one, but your typical student, and a bunch of you, I'm sure, said man marks a noun, and that's true. But you could also man the harpoons or man the lifeboats, and you have that function shift. So again, it's not really what man is, it's what man is doing in the sentence. And look over at number 3, sock. I lost a sock this week. That's probably our typical first response. I'm wearing them on my feet, they're nouns, etc. But you can also sock away plenty of money, or you can sock it to somebody, and that would make that sock into a verb or an action. And what you'll find if you look down a list of words and you start thinking about them is an enormous number of the words in English function in more than one role, in more than one capacity. And when you start exploring this with kids, when you start thinking beyond the notion of memorizing some list of words, when you start thinking about their function rather than their form, you really start to engage the students in comprehension, in thinking about the power of words and the way they interact to derive meaning in sentences. Okay. So parts of speech, what works? First, keep instruction brief and straightforward. I don't need a 4-hour lesson on adjectives. I'm going to keep it clean and simple. And we're going to work it out through activities. We'll work out our glitches. We'll work out our difficulties. Second, we're going to keep identification of various elements to a minimum. So I do some underlining. I do some arrows where we draw arrows from adjectives to noun. We do a little bit of that. I typically use an I do, we do, you do gradual release model when I do that. But that's not going to take over the lesson. It's not going to take over the experience. The third one, we're going to focus primary teaching time on generating and discussing good examples. And fourth, remember that as students get older, they have typically studied the basic parts of speech multiple times already. Be ready to review quickly and then expand the depth of their knowledge. I actually just started working with a student today, and first time I've ever worked with him, and we went through the parts of speech just so I could kind of check in and see what he knew and didn't know. And I found that of those first 4 that we often teach, noun, verb, adjective, and adverb, he knew 2, he didn't know the other 2. And it took me about 5 to 7 minutes to warm up those other 2. That it wasn't that he didn't understand the concept, but that he wasn't able to retrieve the link between the name and the concept. So we warmed those up, and then we were ready to move on to the meaningful things that will build his writing and his reading comp. So those are the kinds of things I want you to think about. We don't need to have a 2-week lesson with a 7th grader on adjectives. That's really not going to be meaningful. If your students haven't generated any examples or practiced the concept in their own speaking and or writing by the end of the lesson, you've actually missed the boat. So we've all done this before, certainly no blame involved, but I do want you to think about that when you're working on your process, when you're working on your lessons. And if you don't get there, if you don't get to this point, you want to rethink for the next day and say, how can I get there next time? So this is the relationship chart I use, and this is from my book, Writing Matters. And the relationship chart shows an association between parts of speech and how they work together. So you'll notice that, color coding is fine, and I've used it here. Some of you really embrace that, and that's great. But I've also used a positioning that really shows how the words work with each other. So you'll see that noun and pronoun, for example, are both navy blue because they really serve the same function. They're interchangeable. And that adjective is also blue, a lighter blue, because those adjectives, which are located, by the way, right underneath the nouns and pronouns, they describe those nouns and pronouns. So you can see that connection. My verb is green. A lot of people use green for verbs because it shows action. And my adverbs describe verbs. They can describe other things, but as we get started, that's where we're going to anchor our thinking. I've also put noun on the left and verb on the right because this will eventually turn into our subjects and predicates as we think a little bit later. Over on the far right, you've got 2 things, preposition and conjunction. And you'll notice they don't touch because they don't really interact with each other, but they both allow us to expand. So our prepositions allow us to add phrases, and our conjunctions allow us to join words and groups of words to build longer and more sophisticated sentences. So I would argue to you that if you put a set of cards with these terms on them in front of most of the students I've taught in my life, they would be able to lay them out in this way, that they would be able to understand the way these words work together, that they interact. So it's not about what a word is, again, it's about how the word works with other words to build meaning. Okay, so I developed this actually for the state of Pennsylvania. It's called the Parts of Speech IECC model, and I've done a lot of work with Patton. I know some of you, Pam Kastner, actually e-blasted this out, which was nice of her, this webinar. I developed this for Pennsylvania, and I spent a lot of time really thinking about it, and I've since used it all over the country. And the idea is this is our practice model. So we have 4 activities. It's the IECC model. And the first activity is identify. So yes, we're going to do some labeling, some marking, things like that. That's fine. We just want to keep that to a minimum. Then we're going to do some sentence expansion, and I'll show you a model of what that might look like. And actually, kids really enjoy sentence expanding. So when you give them a framework, excuse me, when you give them a framework, using words to prompt them to expand to have longer and more sophisticated sentences. Sentence combining is also a super powerful tool, and I already mentioned that the research really supports that. And finally, our most important piece is the creation. So can we generate sentences that are based on the concept that we're working on? So let me show you this broken down. First of all, I would do a little instruction. So I've chosen adjectives. Remember to focus on the job of the word. An adjective describes, maybe you like the word modifies, that's okay, a noun or pronoun. So you see the young child pulled the red wagon, and even a kindergartner or first grader would pretty quickly identify that young is describing child and red is describing wagon. As we get a little older, we can play around with these bottom adjectives. They have a fancy name. You don't really need to know it for tonight, but they're called predicate adjectives. And these adjectives come after a linking verb, but look, it's still the rich brownie and the delicious brownie. A 6-year-old might not pick up on that because the word isn't right next to brownie. It isn't where we're sort of comfortable seeing it, but it still has that great relationship. And I could certainly show the 6-year-old that those two words, that rich and delicious, are describing the brownie. All right, so that would be our instruction. I would go a little more slowly, obviously, for students. So then I build. So we would do some identifying, as you know, and then we would move into some sentence expansion. So the children and their leaders took vans to a campground, and over a campground, the children roasted hot dogs and sang songs, or excuse me, over a campfire. So I try to do a little narrative with this, and I'm going to tell you this, and I'll remind you again. The best of the research says that you would create activities like these out of and from and based on the thinking of the texts they are reading in school. So we would embed this in discussion of Charlotte's Web, or discussion of To Kill a Mockingbird, or the water cycle, or the Revolutionary War, or whatever it might be. And that we would be writing and thinking about and expanding and combining, etc., sentences based around that content. And that anchoring within the content has a really good research effect in terms of bringing to bear the kinds of skills you want students to develop. So I just made some examples here for you, but the rambunctious children and their frazzled leaders took rented vans to a wooded campground. And over a crackling campfire, the hungry children roasted all beef hot dogs and sang hilarious songs. So really the sky's the limit on these. And one of the things that's really important to the Writing Matters approach is that you build in time to share. And I try when I'm doing the sharing of any of these things, whether it's the parts of speech pieces like this or the more sophisticated clause structure work, I try to build in time for everyone in the room to share. If that's not plausible, and I know some of you are classroom teachers with larger groups, if that's not plausible, I'm likely to pick a portion of the room. So I might say the left half or the right half. I might say odd rows and then even rows, something like that. Because what I want to do is I don't want to call on the hands that go up. Because part of what I'm doing with the share is allowing students to share and interact with their examples and to hear each other's vocabulary and options. But the other thing I'm doing is I'm progress monitoring. So I'm assessing where the students are and how they're doing with the activity. And if I only take those kids who raise their hands, I'm not really getting a sense of the general gist of the classroom or how everyone's doing with the content that we're introducing. So again, I would aim to try to hear from everybody. But if that's not plausible because of your numbers or your time constraints, then think about, could I call on the left half of the room for this activity and maybe the right half for the next activity or something like that. Meanwhile, I'm tracking data, I'm making notes, I'm saying, gosh, we don't have this yet, I need to come back. Or everyone seems to have it except the one little boy in the front row, he's confused and I need to make a note of that because I need to get with him later and work that out. So I'm thinking about those pieces as I'm building my instruction. So these are sentence combiners, and the first one is a relatively straightforward one. There's really only one answer. And the second one is a little more sophisticated. So the first one you can actually do, those of you who are working with the youngest children or kids who aren't yet reading and writing, you can actually do this kind of thing with an oral language activity as well. So my friendly grandfather told funny jokes at the table. That's pretty much how that one's going to go. But the second one, my sister and I listened to the jokes and ate snacks. My sisters were hungry. The snacks were nutritious. Our dad had prepared the snacks. We've got several different ways to go. And I've written some of these out. I'm not going to take the time to read them. But the power behind this would be to have kids do a sentence combine at a level like this or lower, and then to have them share so they could start to see that the way they're doing it is not the only choice, and that more than one option has validity. That's one of the powers of writing, is that we have different styles, different approaches, different syntax structures, and that you could have a sentence that's worded differently from mine, and they could both be awesome sentences that would work well in what we're thinking about and what we're writing. Memorizing lists of words and tricks to identify certain parts of speech defeats our purpose. I want you to keep your eye on the ball. This is about function, not form. It focuses attention on labeling this memorizing rather than understanding, and it often misleads rather than informs anyway. So I'm just going to give you a quick example. One of the things that a lot of teachers, and some of you may have done this, and it's fine, but I want to talk to you a little bit about it tonight. One of the things that teachers often teach is that adverbs end in ly, or that they often end in ly. And there are a bunch of ly adverbs, but one of the things that I find troubling about this activity or this trick is that what it turns adverb work into is a seek and find rather than a really engaging kind of comprehension activity. So if you teach me that adverbs all end in ly, then what I start doing is I read the sentences in the activity that you've assigned me, and I start looking for ly words so I can mark them and get the answers right. And that really kind of misleads me, but it also misses the point of the activity, which would be to think about how those adverbs work with the other words in the sentence to change meaning. Also, it doesn't always work. So I give you this first example. He is a friendly guy. And I think all of you would argue or agree with me that friendly is a common word, that a lot of teachers and kids know the word, maybe even all of them, that it has suffix ly in it. And yet that's very clearly an adjective. It's describing the guy. And then I give you the second example. And the second example says, I never did my homework yesterday. And that sentence actually has two adverbs in it, adverbs of time. And those adverbs do not end in ly, and yet they both talk about did. They both, one of them says, I actually didn't, and the other one says when the time frame was, that yesterday was when this happened. So these are not my ly adverbs. So again, think about those tricks and think about if they're only useful to help kids identify something on a worksheet, or whether they really help guide understanding and comprehension of ideas. Whoops, sorry, I went backwards. Okay, so this is a really, really important part of our talk tonight. And if you got a cup of coffee, take a big sip, because it's tough, but I think it's really important. So there are two major categories of conjunction. And I'm guessing most of you know the term conjunction. I usually talk to kids, I cross my arms like this, and I talk about a train junction. And J-U-N-C-T actually means join, so that works really well. And C-O-N is a great prefix, it means together. So coordinating, what I do is I take my fists like this, and I say a coordinating conjunction keeps two things on equal footing. Neither is more important than the other. It's coordinating. And I'll tell kids, I use the example down at the bottom. I say, hey, if you and I are coordinating an event, who's in charge? And there'll be this pause because they're used to the adult being in charge or whatever. And they'll say, well, no one's in charge, or we're both in charge. Exactly. That's exactly what I want to hear from them, because co means with or together. And these words like and or and but, those words hold on to two ideas, and they don't shift the power dynamic between those two ideas. And that's part of why 4- and 5-year-olds use these conjunctions all the time. In fact, they may use them a little too much. I've heard, young children, prior to learning to read, and they'll stream together 7 or 8 sentences with almost as many ands and no breath in between, right? And that's this compounding, if you will. These independent clauses just kind of stream together to create an idea. Not super sophisticated in terms of comprehension. Doesn't really challenge the way the ideas work together. So keep that in mind. Now we're going to do the hard ones. So a subordinating conjunction is different. And I would argue that these are the game changers in terms of sentence writing and sentence comprehending. Subordinating conjunctions have this one job. They only have one job. They start these things called dependent clauses. And here's the deal with subordinating. You all know the term submarine. You probably know the prefix sub, or sub, which means under. Here's the deal. I'm putting my fists up again. Remember that in a coordinating conjunction environment, I've got 2 ideas on equal footing. But a subordinating conjunction is different. Because when a subordinating conjunction starts a clause, it sends that clause underneath. There's a power dynamic there. One idea, the independent clause, is the main idea, and these other ideas are leaning on it. That's such a powerful concept. And we have a whole slew of these conjunctions that we use to combine these ideas in effective ways. I've got 3 examples there for you. While we were home, if Shelby eats her vegetables, and because he wants a new bicycle. These words while and if and because, they are our subordinating conjunctions, and they send those ideas underneath a main idea. So this is really, really important. We're going to come back to this, but this is where we get into comprehension and writing that really impacts students. And I can tell you that kids who are using these sentences with these conjunctions in them, you can tell, even if you don't know what a subordinating conjunction is, even if you don't know what complex sentences are, and that's the kind that has these in them, you can tell that the sentences are combined in more sophisticated ways just by looking at them when kids are able to use these and implement them automatically. All right, we're going to come back to those in a minute. So I can tell you that even little kids are subject predicate pieces. And so what we've got, even little kids can understand subjects and predicates. So you might not use the term predicate, you can use the term verb. What I tend to use with kids is the doer and the do, but I start to use these more sophisticated terms, subject and predicate. And the reason I use them is because Isabel Beck and the other big vocabulary researchers, they will tell you to talk at your level and then explain. So we're going to interact, we're going to shift our thinking about that. We really want to use those terms so kids start to become familiar with them. So the subject is who or what is doing the action, or the doer. In the sentence, the hungry man ate quickly, man is that simple subject, and the hungry man is the complete subject. Don't worry too much about the complete subject. We're really going to focus on the simple subject. And then if you look down at the bottom in the green, the hungry man ate quickly. Ate is the action or the do. That's my simple predicate. So you've got to have a subject and a predicate to have a sentence, basically. So I've got some examples here, and I'm not going to read all of these to you, but they'll frame your thinking later on. So even with young kids, so I've done this very activity with like 4- and 5-year-olds. What I would argue is that you'd put up a photo, and David Coker actually, who does some great elementary writing work at the graduate level, he showed me this for the first time. But the idea behind this is that we have a subject, the doer, and a predicate, the do. And that we frame these with boxes, and I'd write them right up on the board or use your smartboard or whatever you've got. And then you do an action picture. So do a picture that engages the kids, but it has to have a do. So you can't have like a picture of a house or 2 people sitting on a bench. You've got to have something happening. So the picture, I'm not going to pull up a picture now because it would mess with the PowerPoint, but the picture I usually start with is a big bear, and he's standing on his hind legs and he's clearly roaring. And I just did this with a group of 5-year-olds. It was actually hysterical. I had a number of teachers watching, and the bear roared was one kid. And I said, well, that's great. Who's got another one? And one of the kids said, I think the bear's singing. And I said, well, what would you say? The bear sang. And the bear, frankly, looks like it's roaring, but that was fine. This little girl wanted it to be sang. The bear talked. And it occurred to me that that was really interesting because he could have been talking. The face was open wide, but it could have been talking. And yet you don't really think about this was a photograph of a bear, not a cartoon character. You know, this wasn't Winnie the Pooh or something. You don't really think about a bear talking, but this was where this kid was, and clearly she was thinking about that. So anyway, you start with a bare bones sentence like the bear roared, and I usually try to get it from the kids. And then you start to ask yourself questions, and you ask them questions like, what kind of bear? How many bears? Which bear? And then you ask questions about the verb, and you ask things like, where did he roar, and when did he roar, and why did he roar, and how did he roar? And you build these bare bones sentences into something like this and this. And the only word really that I gave them when we did this was the word ferocious came from me, although some of them did know the word when I produced it for them. But I was really impressed with their generation. I almost always am. You've got this pool of kids who are able to share different ideas and collaborate and combine to build these sentences. And I could do this with 5-year-olds every single day, you know, a different picture with a different, subject predicate. Can you do this with more sophisticated kids? Yes. Sentence frames are really powerful. And sometimes you can give them something like, on the other hand, as a building block, and build a much more complicated, sophisticated interaction between ideas. All right. So we're to the power of sentence writing now. Clause structure is the most important piece. This is the core. Clauses are the building blocks of all of our sentences. We combine clauses in different ways to show relationships between groups of words and to increase sentence variety. And the standards, which I think are accurate on this point, say that mainstream 3rd graders are capable of understanding clauses at a straightforward level. I think we teach clauses too late. And I really think we need to get that language and that system of thinking together with kids earlier. So a clause is just a group of words, and it has a subject and its predicate. That's it. Some clauses stand by themselves, some don't. Now, there are 2 different kinds of clauses, and there are only 2, and that's what's so powerful about this syntax structure is. It's pretty black and white. You'll get sentences that are tricky, that make it a little bit unclear, but overall, it's a pretty black and white system without a whole lot of weird exceptions. There are 2 kinds of clauses, one independent and one dependent. And what I'll ask kids is, what are some things you do independently? And what are some things you do, but you depend on someone else? And they'll come up with things. The independent might be, I feed myself, or I get dressed. And the dependent might be, well, I didn't cook, or somebody had to buy my food, or I can't drive yet, etc. Those kinds of conversations. So that's the way clauses work too. They all have subjects and predicates. Some can stand by themselves and some can't. So here are some independent clauses. And some of you may think, well, those are sentences. You're right that they can be sentences, but they can also be combined with other things to create more sophisticated, interesting sentences. I painted a picture. The teacher walked into the room. My friends drank all the tea. Here's some dependent clauses. Now, folks, these don't stand alone, but they still have subjects and predicates. So look for them as I'm reading. While I was napping, if you finish your homework, after we got home from school. Still clauses, not independent. These are dependent clauses. And what I do with kids, and you'll notice on these slides, I've used a serif font with the D and the I. I'm going to flip back one. See the I in orange has a little top bar and a bottom bar. That's called a serif font. And what I use those symbols for is that I actually represents the independent clause. It stands by itself and it has its own base. And the kids like that kind of visual representation of the language concept. The dependent clause, on the other hand, has a rounded bottom. So it will fall over if it doesn't have support. And what kids need to know is that all sentences, especially in expository text, but all sentences have to have at least one independent clause. Everything else is negotiable, but we have to have an independent clause. Sometimes kids think you can lean two dependent clauses together to create a sentence, and that doesn't work. So a simple sentence is one independent clause, and that is one of those independent clauses we talked about. You put a period at the end and bam, you've got a sentence. And my message for simple sentences, that simple sentences are not necessarily simplistic. Simple means one independent clause. That's it. So I slept is a simple sentence. It's also simplistic. But in the virtual presentation, William provided an overview of syntax to the eager participants. At least I hope you're eager. That's also simple. It's not simplistic, but it's simple because it has one subject-predicate relationship William provided. All right, so keep that in mind as we go. Compound sentences can actually be introduced to first graders. You would not use the term clause, and that's noted at the bottom. But a compound sentence is two independent clauses, and they are joined by a comma and one of the 7 words in the top left-hand corner of the slide. John went to the store, independent clause. Comma is mandatory. One of those 7 words, but, is the one I've chosen here, and another independent clause. It was closed. And kids can build these very, very young, as long as their handwriting and their spelling, those systems are intact. And otherwise, they can actually generate them orally. So I gave you a few examples here. I'm not going to share them with you right now. All right, here's the power again. A complex sentence is one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. Basic complex sentences follow one of these 2 patterns, D, I, or ID. And believe it or not, the students I teach, when they learn complex sentences, I'll say, will you write me a complex sentence today? And remember, I'm going to ask them to write on content that we're studying or working on, because we're always going to bring our syntax back into the content. And they will ask me, do you want a D, I, or do you want an ID pattern? Also, they're going to have a list of these powerful conjunctions available to them. Again, it's not about memorizing. That's not the point of what we're doing. This is about engendering the use of different words to build relationships between ideas. So the dependent clause begins with the subordinated conjunction, don't forget. So I've written 2 for you. Whenever it rains, that's a dependent clause. Whenever is the subordinating conjunction. I forget my umbrella. And I would argue to you that whenever is the most important word in that sentence. Whenever says it didn't just happen once, it wasn't bad luck, it's every single time. I like ice cream because it tastes delicious. That's different from I like ice cream and it tastes delicious. Because shows a cause and effect relationship. Ice cream's good, and guess why it's good? Because it tastes awesome. So those 2 words, whenever and because, begin to show you the way that subordinating conjunctions connect ideas in sentences. So I love this activity. I do this with kids, and I do this with teachers in my syntax intensives as well. So I've written you exactly the same sentence 6 different ways. Well, let me rephrase that. I've written you the same sentence 6 times, and all I've done is change the subordinating conjunction. So the first one says, while I studied, my sister ran screaming through the house. So, I was studying, and at the same time, she's screaming. After I studied, okay, so in that one, she was nice. She waited until I finished studying, and then she ran screaming through the house. Before, same idea, but beforehand, you know what? She timed it well, and then when she saw I was getting going, she stopped. Now we start to get to the mean ones. Look at number 4. Because I studied. Okay, so she was like wandering around doing her own thing, and then she saw that I was studying, and holy cow, that's when she started screaming. Although I studied, you know what? She should have known better. Here I am studying. It doesn't seem to matter to her. And then the bottom one is perhaps the most depressing, which is every single time I studied, she ran screaming through the house. So you can see again, I've changed a single word, these powerful subordinating conjunctions, and I've shifted the entire relationship between the ideas in these clauses. Okay, so this is a lot for the end, but this is really, really important for what we're thinking about, guys. Remember that a complex sentence has one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. And this is hard to do in an hour, what we're about to do, but it's really, really important because it ties into that reading comp piece. So we have talked about dependent clauses that start with those words like unless and until, those subordinating conjunctions. But these other ones, these adjective clauses, they start with who, which, or that, usually. And they're called relative clauses. Relative clauses or adjective clauses, they're really good names for what these things are. Let me show you. So the relative or adjective clause is in orange in these sentences. And the reason it's called an adjective clause, which you might not have heard of, people think of adjective as like, you know, ugly to go with ugly duckling, but adjective introduces a whole group of things, words and phrases and clauses. Anyway, so look, who was nearing retirement is a clause. Subject who, predicate was nearing. And that group of words describes the doctor. It is telling more about the doctor. Now, here's the catch. Two things are tough about this. One, Cheryl Scott and other researchers have indicated that the further the main subject is from its predicate, the harder the sentence is to understand. So, if you look at number one, doctor is the main subject, had is the main predicate, and we've got a lot of stuff in between. And so when you've got a reader or a listener dealing with one of these sentences, you've got to hold on to the word doctor while you're thinking about all the orange stuff, and then reconnect back to doctor at the end. Let me do the second one with you. That table, which is $1 million antique, will never leave our family. Again, which is $1 million antique tells us more about the table. It functions as an adjective or a relative clause. And the subject of the main clause, of the independent clause, is table. And the predicate is will leave. So you can see how far apart those are. Now, here's the punchline, or the second part that's really tough. This kind of complex sentence doesn't show up in fiction very often. It's not in our easier reading. It tends to show up in informational text. So it's on things like the water cycle or photosynthesis or the Revolutionary War. And when you take difficult syntax like this and you layer in difficult, unfamiliar vocabulary and difficult, unfamiliar content and processes and things, then you get into syntax, if you will, overload. And you get into a structure where they're really, really bogged down. So part of it is the syntax. Part of it is the content in which this kind of syntax appears. So I teach this kind of sentence for writing. Sure, it's a great sentence to learn how to write, but it's also so vital for our reading comprehension connection. So I've given you just a couple of others here. And what you'll see here is I put them at the end here. So I spent hours preparing the chicken dish. That's an independent clause, which was delicious, nutritious, and well prepared. And that actually describes the dish. These clauses always come right after the nouns they describe. Mark watches any show. That's our independent clause. That holds his interest. Oh, wait a minute. Mark doesn't watch any show. He watches the ones that engage him. I handed the outfit to Sue, who looked at it with disdain. So I handed it to Sue. That's my independent clause. Wait a minute. She didn't have a reaction that was all that good, though. She looked at it and she was like, this isn't something I'm going to wear. So you can see these clauses. You'll see them much more in informational text, and you'll see them as comprehension difficulties, if you will. Okay. So Scott, who I mentioned, Brimo, Scott's done some more recent stuff too in 2014. I think she's retired now. But here's the deal. A student must understand 90 to 95% of the words on a page to understand the content. That said, a student can understand all the words in a text and, due to syntax, still find that text completely incomprehensible. So here's what I'm telling you that, guys. I could write a piece of text where I simplify the vocabulary to the point where your students know every single word in the passage, guaranteed. We could check it. But I could word the sentences in a way that they would be completely lost by what's being conveyed anyway, even though they know all the words. So consider these two examples. These are more of those relative or adjective clauses. Sentence 1 says, Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States. And then the follow-up is, he was born in Kentucky and had 3 children. The second possibility is, Abraham Lincoln, who was born in Kentucky and had 3 children, was the 16th president of the United States. And you can see the second option is more difficult to understand, but it's also more interesting and more sophisticated. So you've got that syntactic variety. One of the things that you see about sentences like these is when kids are little, they write the way they speak and they speak the way they write. But as they get older, their written syntax, our written syntax, varies from our spoken syntax. We write with more sophistication. We write with more clause structure. And that we can handle more when we write. We can also handle more than when we read. So if you think about our struggling readers and our struggling writers, when they try to read this piece, they're already grappling with things like decoding and fluency, etc. And then they're dealing with syntactic variety like this. They also often have reduced reading experience. They don't read as much as their peers, so they don't get the practice with this kind of syntax that their age peers would get. So they're behind in that way as well. Okay, so we're going to pull together all the elements of our sentence, our lesson. Number 1, instructor introduces the concept clearly and succinctly using both a visual and a verbal description. We're going to write it, we're going to talk about it, we're going to discuss it, but it's not going to take forever. Number 2, students identify the element in pre-written sentences, a brief portion of the lesson. Number 3, students conduct activities such as sentence expanding, sentence combining, unscrambling, and imitating to practice their knowledge and application of the given element and to take the first steps towards enhancing their sentence level writing. Number 4, students create their own examples of the element. Number 5, students share those examples with the class. Remember what I talked to you guys about that. I want to hear oral language. I want to hear them practicing it. I want them to listen and comprehend other kids. And I'm also getting progress monitoring data when that happens. And number 6, the instructor uses those examples to clarify, to expand upon student knowledge. So we're using the student examples. And if you use this activity series, if you use this on sentences and things they're writing about the text they're reading, you also get to check their comprehension of the story they're reading. So you get your writing piece, and you also get your comprehension of Charlotte's Web or To Kill a Mockingbird or whatever it might be. So we introduce, we identify, we expand, combine, unscramble, imitate, we generate, we share, we discuss. So I'm going to wrap up in just about a minute, and then we're going to take some questions. But here's the deal. I have some products that go with this. I just want to briefly talk to you about. On the left is my book, Writing Matters. I'm working on a new syntax book as well, and I'm working on a composition and essay book. And I will say that being grounded has made me be able to write a little bit more than I have been in the past 6 or 8 months. I have 2 workbooks. I have some great card games and binder inserts. And Kendore carries them, KendoreLearning.com. It's right there in the middle. And you can see, you can have sort of access to that and see some of those materials in a little more deep fashion if that's of interest to you. Also, I'm providing syntax intensives. And for a long time in my career, people have been asking me to do some online trainings. And I've always resisted because I've been on the road and I wanted to do it in person. And that really isn't an available option to us right now. So I've been doing these relatively inexpensive intensives, and they're 5 sessions each, 25 participants each. I filled 6. I don't know why, but I thought I would have trouble filling one. We're working on enrollment for the 7th, and we'll have an 8th and 9th. And they're interactive, they're hands-on, and the reason I'm doing 25 participants is because it gives participants a chance to share, to interact, to ask questions. We do it in conversation. We unmute and we talk and we share and we practice with this. And I'm going to be launching some on vocabulary, on composition throughout the summer as well. So my final note before I turn things back over to Jennifer and we do some questions and answers is, I want to thank Jennifer. I want to thank Kendore for hosting this event, and I also want to thank Jennifer's partner in crime, Catherine, who has been great in facilitating our process tonight and over the past week as we've been setting things up. So thanks very much. And Jennifer, you're on, my friend.
What is the length of your lesson, kind of depending on age?
Good. That's a great question. So I'm tutoring a 5th grader right now, and it's a full hour. If I'm doing one-on-one tutorial, it often is a full hour. It may be, though, I know a lot of you are coming from a Kendore approach or an orton-gillingham based approach similar to, or what have you. And I think what you'll find is that as kids develop their phonological awareness, their phonics, their decoding, their reading, and that gets going, you're going to start to sort of shift some of your work into morphology, vocabulary, written expression, some of the things that might not have been your priority at the beginning. So I would be surprised if a typical kid who is struggling across the board suddenly starts doing an hour per session of writing. I think it would be a portion of the existing session. I do writing tutoring, that's all I'm doing right now, and that is a full hour. If I were doing a little tyke, it would be less. And I know some of you are classroom teachers, and I think, the writing, typically we'd like to see kids, doing 90 minutes of writing throughout the day in some capacity, but that would include handwriting, spelling, phoneme graphing, mapping, sentence, it's all the different components. And they wouldn't happen all at once, obviously. A 6-year-old is not going to be able to sustain 90 minutes of writing.
Okay. How do you feel about mentor sentences?
So that's a really interesting question. I am working on this new book, and I am definitely putting in mentor sentences. I think mentor sentences have to be used carefully, and that it's a little bit like the word grammar, that when people use them, they mean different things sometimes. So the way I'm using them is this. I'm developing a scope and sequence of skills. It's in a logical, progressive order. There isn't just one sequence for syntax, but it's a logical, progressive skill set. I think it makes sense. And in each lesson, I am including mentor sentences from well-known books, etc., to show teachers what that extraction might look like. Picking a quote, looking at, say, the adjectives in that quote, having lessons talking about those pieces. Now, ideally, those are models, and what a teacher would do is pull sentences from the text she's reading with her kids. That would be your best case scenario. I don't think putting a mentor sentence up in front of the class and saying, kind of write like this, or look at what this writer's doing, works with, I don't know, the bottom 50, the bottom 60% of our kids, unless it's fit into this system again, a structure, an approach where all the pieces kind of fit together logically. You have to show them that concept you're showing them has to fit into a context or a framework so it makes sense. So I think that's that, and you really have to do the gradual release model where we're doing a lot of kind of hand-holding and sort of we-do approach when we're playing around with those kinds of sentences. So that's kind of my take on mentor sentences. I think if they're used that way, if they're used very kind of linearly across a series of lessons, and if they're used very carefully, that they're powerful and can be really useful.
Okay. We just, honestly, it was interesting because the last 10 questions that have come in have all been the same type of thing. How do you approach teaching a student who cannot read at the level that they are capable of understanding? How do you teach some of this stuff orally?
Okay. So one thing I'll tell you that I do a lot with struggling writers, and I worked at a school for dyslexic students for 15 years. And I've certainly worked with dyslexics. I've got one of my students right now that I tutor on Skype. He's dyslexic. I think one of the things to say about that is that oftentimes I will scribe, and that scribing takes the handwriting and the spelling off the table. Those are no longer issues. And that we do a lot of sort of reading back, sharing those things, what have you, with the kids. All of that said, I do have a caveat. So I had a parent recently, and our kid is, I don't know, 11 or 12 years old. I never met the kid. And she said, well, he's 4th or 5th grade. I can't remember. So maybe that's 10 or 11 years old. Anyway, she says he's reading at sort of a kindergarten, 1st grade level. What parts of syntax should I be doing? And I thought to myself, and I kind of said this to her in a very gentle fashion. I said, you know what? Reading, phonological awareness, phoneme-graphic mapping, the link between spelling and reading, those are your priorities. You'll have time for syntax later. You can certainly do some with oral reading, read alouds, those kinds of things, but you're not going to get that embedded written expression practice from those kids until you get some of that basic decoding level down. So that's kind of a roundabout answer, but anyway, that's the answer.
Okay. Also, the lovely Georgette Dickman would like to know how you keep instruction lively when you're tutoring one-on-one.
Hi, Georgette. So Georgette's going to be seeing some of this when we do she's enrolled in my syntax intensive. I'm super flattered that she's joining me. I go way back with Georgette because I actually taught her son eons ago, her son who is now a police officer. Anyway, I think the trick is this. I started a kid today who did not want to tutor. I can tell you right now, his mom asked me if I would tutor him 6 months ago, and I said, I'm really too busy. And then with the virus, she figured I had more time, and she reached out again. And so I couldn't basically say that I was quite as busy as I used to be. So I took this on, and he wasn't super happy today. And he got better, but it wasn't easy at first. It's going to get easier, I think. And one of the things I did was we started talking about and writing about things that matter to him, and I don't think that he expected that. So, if his mom is on here, please don't throw me under the bus, but with your son, but we wrote about baseball today, and I'm going to tell you that baseball is not my favorite sport. And boy, did I seem interested. And we talked about the different things that are important on teammates. We got going, and those were actually, of the things we did, the best sentences he wrote and the best thinking he did was embedded in content he was familiar with and knew and liked and was passionate about. If I were a classroom teacher or a tutor who was working on reading as well, we would have a text to go on. So we could be talking about the novel we're reading. We could talk about Percy Jackson or Holes or something like that. But I don't have that framework with him. So I couldn't build that. So really getting them to kind of experience that. And I also think with syntax, my second level is this. I'm tutoring his older brother as well, interestingly. And his older brother has really started to click with the way the pieces fit as kind of like a puzzle. And there are some aha moments and some connections where he's saying, oh, wait a minute, so this is that. And I don't let on that I can tell he's engaged, that would give me away. But the level of kind of connection with this makes sense, this is logical, writing might be something I can do, that's also helpful in that process.
Okay. At what grade do you introduce the term subordinating conjunction? Can you, and that was a question a couple times, can that be in 1st and 2nd grade?
Okay, so that's a really good question. And I actually got into a discussion about this in one of my syntax intensives. It wasn't about this, it was about participles, but same thing, an advanced term and when is it good to use it? So I would tell you guys this, and I know I was talking fast, and I tend to do that anyway, and we had a lot of content, but clause structure isn't in the standards until mainstream 3rd grade. So there's no reason to think about or talk about subordinating conjunctions, at least as a concept. I mean, because is one of them. You can talk about because with a 1st grader, but the concept of subordinating conjunctions, I wouldn't introduce that until 3rd grade because the only reason to use them or to think about them is in the framework of clause structure. So if you're not going to do independent and dependent clauses, subordinated conjunctions as a concept are kind of not useful. I'd be more inclined to say, let's talk about when, the word when. So, you know, I eat my breakfast when I am, you know, getting ready for school or something. You know, talk about how that works, but not get into the connection between that group of words and their functions until third grade mainstream. So there's a wonderful school that I've consulted with over 20 years. It's All Dyslexics. It's in Houston, Texas. And they do the third grade mainstream workbook and framework in 5th grade. It doesn't say third grade on it, because what they've found is getting the reading and the skills going, that cognitively they're probably ready in third grade, but that skills wise, I don't think that's a word, but skills wise, probably not until 5th grade. And that's been a good place for them to do that. But mainstream third grade, and I've seen a lot of mainstream third graders do this successfully with no problem.
Okay. Is your book Writing Matters, is it a step-by-step organized program that's ready to be implemented?
So the answer to that is no. Those of you who are Orton-Gillingham trained, you'll get this parallel. Writing Matters is an approach, not a method. So it's an approach of writing for teaching writing. It's got all of the concepts from noun through to advanced stuff like participles, but it's not put in a level 1, step 1 process. There is in the back a sequence of skills by grade level. So you can take the grade level at which you're operating, either the student is at that grade level or functioning at that grade level, and you can sequence the concepts, but it's approach, not method. Now, the new book that I'm writing right now is going to be much more kind of laid out step by step. It's going to be 4th through 12th grade, I think, is where I'm framing it right now. And that's going to be more of what that question was aimed towards. It'll be a series of lessons that are kind of ready to be presented in the order that they're laid out.
Okay. How can you tell if comprehension issues are due to syntax or vocabulary? And do you have any tests you recommend for teasing that out?
I would be happy to email some people some assessment stuff. That is not my superpower, so I would want to check the names of the tests I'm thinking about before I say them on a recorded webinar. There's a wonderful book on assessment tools for writing, and there are some assessments. And I have a friend in Pennsylvania who's a graduate professor who does assessment, and he could also lead me to a list, but that's not my superpower, and I don't really want to do a recording for all of eternity saying the wrong name of a test. So that would be that part. In terms of comprehension versus vocab, or excuse me, syntax versus vocab. I'm thinking about that question. I think it's a really, really good question. I mean, if I really wanted to test syntax and see if it's syntax, not vocab, I would create sentences that are syntactically at the level I wanted to test, and I would make sure there were no vocabulary words that were challenging. So that would be a way. I don't know of an assessment that does that, but that would be a way.
There is. I mean, I think it probably falls a little bit more under speech and language.
Okay.
Like with the, you know, but yeah, I completely agree with you. I probably, you know, am out of my.
Yeah, I would wipe out. I'd say the wrong name, and then people would be able to watch me make a mistake.
Yeah, like I mean, I do it, but not on a, you know, I'm not an educational psychologist. But I would say something like a PPVT or something like that, where you could find out their oral vocabulary was good, and then maybe like the self, which is, you know, going to be more about syntax from an oral perspective. That way you could see if that's transitioning into your writing.
So that would be really interesting. And the oral language piece is, of course, really, really important. But guys, also be aware. So once you do something like that, you've got to bridge the gap, because we know that written vocabulary and written syntax are more sophisticated, right? So after we do the oral language pieces, you know, the kinds of sentences that you can read are not sentences you could listen to and understand. And you guys have all been in a situation where you're hearing a book, or, you know, there's some books I've just read, wonderful books, that if I tried to do that listening while I was like, you know, making breakfast or something, that would not happen. There's too much syntactic complexity. So we'd have to tease that apart. That's such a really good question, though. I kind of want to think more about that. But I think Jennifer's right. I think we've got an oral language. We can tease apart those things. I don't know if there's a written language assessment that would tease those apart, but there is a written language assessment that does things like, are you able to do sentence combining effectively, those kinds of things, and that would be a bridge gap for those things.
Okay. Does it matter whether you introduce adjectives or adverbs first?
That's a very concrete question. Let me give you a very concrete answer. Adjectives are a lot easier. They're a lot more straightforward, and you can have a lot more fun with them. They're much more vivid. You can use them to really impart a picture with kids, and I think they engage with those better. So I see people doing those more often. They're easier to generate. And adverbs tend to be a little more limited. In the elementary grades, a lot of them do end in that ly thing. So, you know, it's how he ran quickly or something like that. Not quite as wonderful, not quite as fascinating as really getting kids building these interesting adjectives. So I would say adjectives first is a good way to go.
Okay, yeah, there are a lot of those. So then I started reading a whole bunch of them and got distracted by the list of questions. If kids do not, basically the gist of this, I'm gonna summarize it. If they are using incomplete sentences and they don't realize that they are not complete thoughts, how do you handle that when dealing with that orally?
That's a really good question. So folks, I get that question a lot, and I think it's because people are sort of grappling with kids who are writing fragments, writing run-ons, and then worse, they may not know it's even after you kind of point it out, they're like, no, I think that's a complete sentence. So I would tell you to go back to the content I was talking about, which is this. Subjects and predicates are vital. They're the building blocks of all sentences. And without them, you don't have a sentence. So I was in a really interesting environment up in Montana. I'm on a grant up there that's really fascinating. And I was working with a middle school, high school English teacher. And I know this may be older than the older kids than the question, but bear with me for a minute. And the teacher, he's a great guy, young teacher, and he is not convinced that syntax and clause structure and all that, he was not convinced that was useful. But he and I have been working together for 2 years, and he kind of trusted me and said, look, I'll do this, I'll try some of this. And I taught him, and then he went and experimented, and I came back. And I'm up there once a month with these schools. So I got to go back and visit him. It's a really neat environment because it's not this sort of one-time flash in the pan training. And when I went in, I walked in the door, and Jake's a great guy, but he is not just going to give in because I'm the consultant. That's not how Jake operates. I walked in and he said, you've convinced me. And I said, how did that happen? He said, well, I taught subject predicate, I taught clause, and for the first time, my middle school students understood that when they tried to use a title as a topic sentence, it wasn't a sentence because they could say, wait a minute, this doesn't have a verb. And he said, I almost emailed you right then and said you were right, but I figured I would let you stew for a little while until you got here, and then I would tell you. So that subject predicate building block, I think we spend too much time fixing run-ons and fixing fragments. I would rather us spend more time generating good sentences rather than going in and fixing other people's mistakes. So that's kind of a, I don't know, that's my frame for that.
Okay. The rest
I've
of
been told to stop sharing my screen so you can see me larger, so I'm going to try that now.
Yeah, that's what Catherine wanted you to do. I was trying to do it, but I couldn't.
Did I do it? Did I do it?
You did it, yes.
Okay,
yes.
good. That wasn't even that hard. I'm sorry, all of you who are here. There I am larger.
Yeah. Would you refer to adjective clauses as positives as well?
No, that is such a good question. And now I want to share the screen again. So can I do that? Okay, so let me just show you. I didn't do that because there's not enough time, but I will. I'll do that right now and show you what the difference. Such a good question. So wait a minute. See, I know what you all really wanted during the questions was more syntax. So I'm super happy to be able to give it to you. So let me show you. That's such a good question. And appositives are so great. It was one of those things where I was like, can I fit that in? And then I thought, no, it's not going to make it. So let me show you all the difference. And it fits into all the stuff we were just learning too. So watch. Jennifer Hasser, are you the president, Jennifer? What's your title?
I'm running for president. No, I'm kidding.
No, I meant of Kendore.
I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, I just call myself executive director.
Okay, I'll do that. Jennifer Hasser, the executive director at Kendore, runs wonderful literacy centers as well. Okay, now watch, guys. Okay, this thing is an appositive. It is a noun or pronoun, and it's renaming another noun or pronoun. Okay, now watch, guys. This is different. Jennifer Hasser, who is the executive, I can't type that word, sorry, director at Kendore, blah, blah, blah. Now, wait a minute. This is not an appositive. This is an adjective or relative clause. And check it out, guys. Who is? There's a subject and a predicate. That's what makes this a clause. Appositives, no clause for you. There's no subject, no predicate. Does one mean something different from the other? Not really. That's about syntactic variety. That's about building our repertoire and building our options. Okay, that's the end of that answer. What else?
How does punctuation instruction enter into your scope and sequence?
These are the best questions. Jennifer, you are the best question chooser ever. Okay, so here's the deal, everybody. I believe that, so there's a teacher in Greenville, South Carolina, she's retired now, and she taught the 10th graders. And in February every year, because I tutored a lot of these students, they had what I referred to as comma half month, okay? And it was 2 weeks of page after page of sentences that were to be punctuated correctly with little comma rules. And there are 9 comma rules. And I can tell you all, as excited as I am about appositives, I'm not going to teach you the 9 comma rules tonight. You're okay. Okay, so here's the deal though about that. That wasn't a good way to teach the kids who she most wanted to reach, who were the ones who were making like 20 comma errors per page, I'm sure. I think it probably was a good way to teach the kids who were really good at this and just needed a little fine tuning. Quick overview, good to go. But the kids who really need the instruction, they need that punctuation embedded in the syntax. So for example, I teach compound sentences. I teach the comma that goes with them. I teach complex sentences. There's a D, comma, I, and an ID. One takes a comma, one doesn't. So you frame the punctuation into the syntactic structures. So it comes one at a time as you're building your sentence knowledge, and it's embedded, it works with the skill, rather than let's memorize these rules and hope that while you're writing, you've internalized the rules enough just to apply them automatically, which by the way, won't happen, just saying. So, all right, what's your next awesome question, Jennifer?
What place do you teach in Houston? Everyone wants to know, but I thought you said Dallas.
Oh, I mean, can I promote schools? I don't know. So I've worked at a number of schools in Houston. The Joy School is a lovely, wonderful, interactive school. The school I was talking about, though, I've worked with for over 20 years. The head there, Carol Wills, saw me when I was very young at the National IDA conference. And that school is Briarwood. And I'm there a couple of times a year. But there are some other wonderful schools in Houston. Like I said, the Joy School is one. There's a speech school there whose name has escaped me. Anyway, great schools there, big city, lots of great educational opportunities.
When will your new book be ready? And what is the title of it?
That's an unfair and ugly question. No, it's not. I'm teasing you. So that question pins me to a deadline. I will tell you guys this. I've been working on the composition essay book, and I kind of put that aside because I'm doing these syntax workshops and I'm focused on the syntax book. It is coming really fast right now, but I think that my ability to travel or not travel affects that deadline. And also the last time I said a deadline out loud about something I was writing, a lot of people were mad when I missed the deadline. The book is going to be called Syntax Routines. I do know that. So that has been named. I'm happy with the title. It'll have a subtitle. I don't know what that is.
Okay. I think that's about it for original questions.
Okay.
Oh, wait, some are coming in now.
Okay.
Will you write a book for K through 3?
You know, the moment I said 4 through 12, I thought to myself, okay, so a K through 3 book. So Writing Matters is K through 12, and there's a lot of stuff for the primary grades. And I think some of Syntax Routines would apply to K through 3. I think part of the trick with K through 3 is it would be a book that would have a lot more oral language drill and oral language practice in it. So if I did that for K through 3 in that way, I think I would probably get a co-author who works in oral language as a specialty, and we would play with something like that followed my syntax practices, but didn't just stick with that. And I think part of the reason I'm cutting off at 4, and it might end up 3, but I think 4 is because, remember guys that I said the standards introduce clause structure starting in 3rd grade. So you think about 4th grade as sort of the place where you can start to really embed the clause structure, and that's a core piece of the writing approach. So I'm not opposed, but I think it would look very different. And the workbooks I've written are 3rd grade and 4th grade mainstream. So there's actually, they're called Sentence Sense, and Kendore does carry those.
And this question has actually been pretty common. How does your, how will your approach go with 2 programs? One, the Writing Revolution, and the other, the one that shall not be named.
Oh, okay. So Judith Hoffman's stuff and the Writing Revolution and Wexler, they're awesome. She does a great job. I worked at a school an hour and a half north of Hockman's place. And I've only met Judith Hockman once briefly. She does writing trainings in a very powerful way. And I think her approach and her thinking about writing is really meaningful. So I think that's great. So let me say this about the other. I'm not into political battles. I will tell you guys this. Some of the most interesting work I do as a consultant coming into schools is where I go into a school where they're using a workshop model and they want to keep the workshop model. And I'm not at all there to destroy the workshop model, but they want to embed into the workshop model a direct explicit component that involves teaching sentence level and paragraph level and essay level work explicitly. And they want to marry that to what's going on so that their mini lessons follow a framework of understanding language. And I find that work some of the most rewarding I do because it takes something that does have some benefits with kids who have developed good reading and writing skills already, and it marries it to something that is structured and meaningful in the way that we want to work with kids. And I think the product is powerful. So I think that's really, there's my ability to sidestep your question and yet engage with it at the same time. And that's what I'm going to say on that topic.
Okay. Do any of your resources show a lesson plan format that you follow?
So 2 answers to that. The Sentence Sense workbooks are definitely laid out explicitly in a sequence. Those are workbooks, and they are page 1, start there, page 5 is the 5th thing you do, and blah, blah, blah. They're very explicit and laid out, and they have teaching pages in them. They are mainstream 3rd, mainstream 4th. That's what I've written. In terms of a lesson plan for teaching writing in general, there are 2 things I would say, and they're both in our PowerPoint. So I'm just going to briefly reference them. One of them is that you teach something and then you use the IECC template I mentioned to you. And the other is the final slides before I got to the references, which were that model of you teach, you do a little bit of identifying, you do some expanding and combining and what have you, and then you create, and out of the creation, you share, you discuss, and you build your writing piece off of the discussion you have about the writing. And that all of this, after the initial instruction, all of it is embedded in discussion of genuine text that they are reading or experiences. It doesn't have to be something they've read, that they are engaging with in their classrooms, in their lives, what have you.
Okay. What do you recommend that they do after they've completed your workbook, sentence sense? Do you have anything else in the works?
I mean, I think the sentence sense books get the elementary level writing going at the sentence level only, guys, because it's just sentence level. I think if you've got, from there, once you've got those foundations in place, that's where I would go to the sentence template I was talking about, where we are learning about a sentence, we are practicing them intensely, we are analyzing them in text, we are generating our own, we are reading them, we're sharing them, we're discussing them. So it becomes a more organic process, and it can be either guided by the tutorial, or those of you who are classroom teachers, it can be guided by the ELA series you're using or what have you, in terms of not the order of concepts, but the kinds of activities you're building based on, you know, the story or what have you. So, you know, I've been finding quotes to go in this new book, and I can tell you that, you know, at the sentence level, something like, I don't know, Lord of the Flies is quite different syntactically, what he's doing with sentence structure, than something like, I don't know, Huck Finn, for example. And yet they're not way off in grade level. They both tend to be taught in kind of 8th, 9th grade. So I think part of what I would do syntactically would be determined by the text that you were reading and discussing in class, in terms of what you could do.
There are two questions that have been like taking up the last like 30 entries, and they are kids with retrieval issues that have trouble with word finding. That's the first one. And the second one is online teaching, because I think that's a big thing for everyone right now.
Yeah. So, and
a lot of are one-on-one.
Yeah, no, exactly. So word retrieval is my answer is simple. The solution is not simple, but my answer is simple. I give kids a lot of word banks. I give them a lot of lists of words. I really play to I like subordinated conjunctions. The students I'm working with, they have a little binder insert. It's one of the things I sell, but you can make your own. They have a little binder insert, and when they're going to write complex sentences, they pull out their subordinated conjunction list, and they're building from that. Or if we're going to talk about a particular topic, you know, I was working on this baseball thing. Okay, so let's say, I mean, this kid knows the baseball terminology because it's a sport, but let's say that it's a kid who's not into baseball, and he's got to write something on baseball, you know, as the national pastime for a school assignment. I would be inclined to help him generate terms that are baseball related, and to provide some of those, what have you. Get those on a list first. And then when he goes to write, he's not trying to do word retrieval and syntax and paragraph essay structure. That's too many demands on the working memory. So that would be the word retrieval issue. The online piece is this. I mean, I really do think writing, there's a power in the writing piece online. So I've been tutoring for a long time using Google Docs. And one of the powers of Google Docs is you and your student can write at the exact same time in a document, and they can build text together. And that, you know, Jennifer, you all do some of that kind of work too. So like, yeah. I mean, I think that's super powerful. So you know, the kid I was working with today, he had some misspellings. Well, spelling isn't on our agenda. We're working on composition. So I was fixing his spellings as he was writing, so we never even looked at them. That was really cool. He wrote a sentence. I color-coded the subject and predicates at his direction. He told me what to say. So we're really building this piece. I think in some ways that's easier than face-to-face tutoring, because you're sharing a document, and face-to-face, you got to hand me the piece of paper, or we've got to be on the same computer, and here's your turn, let me turn around the computer, whatever. You know, I think there's actually a power to that. And I do use Skype or Zoom for that, because you want a little face contact. The kid I tutored for the first time today, he looked away and got distracted by what turned out to be his dog, right? And I was doing something kind of complicated with him, and all of a sudden his face was not available. I saw the top of his head, and I was like, what the heck's happening? Okay, so I was like, hey buddy, what's going on? You know, whatever. I would say his name, but I'm not going to. So then he looks up and he goes, oh, I'm sorry, my dog was sitting on my foot. I'm like, okay, not a good time to introduce subordinating conjunctions while your dog is on your foot, right? So you can really, so I did that connection with them, and I got a couple of laughs out of him. So I was like, okay, this is actually working. He's not hating this as much as he thought he would. So, but the online piece, that building document, and the other neat thing about that document, folks, if you haven't tried this, is you have a running record of everything you've built together. So when I do Google Docs with kids, I don't actually take notes like on a pad. I open up the Google Doc for the next session, and I've left the notes for me and for the kid right there in the Google Docs. It's a super organized way to think about tutoring because it just sort of sits there as this entity.
And I don't know if you know this, William, but when we use your, we use your stuff at our centers. When we work with kids on writing, we send them your games. So
I don't even send people my games, and I made the games. Who knew that? That's super awesome.
We send them the games, and then we each have our own deck of your cards, and we have a document camera. They can still use their camera,
right.
And then we build our sentences, virtually. And then they get to manipulate it, and then they have, something in front of them that they can use to develop their sentences.
So my real question for you, Jennifer, is do you let the kids win? Or that doesn't happen?
I don't let anyone win.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. Okay, good. So I was just checking in. I wanted us to be consistent.
It's got to feel really good. They know that you throw a game, then they just
right. Exactly. Good. So so that's awesome. I really didn't know that. I send kids my binder inserts. I ship them from my shipping, so they've got those as reference, but I've never mailed the games to anybody. That's cool. Especially in this time when, face-to-face tutoring is not a safe thing for us to be doing.
Yeah, we send them our whiteboards and all of it so that they can write it all out if they're young, so, and it just, just depends on their age. Because if it's harder for them to type, when they get older, then that's easier. But yes, so we love your stuff. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
It is time for us to wrap everything up. And I appreciate all of you for attending. Those of you who are tuning in later and not live, thank you as well. And thank you very much, William. This was wonderful. I always learn something.
Well, I had a great time. Thank you for having me. And folks, you'll get emails from both of us, but my email will have a PDF of the PowerPoint. And I'll give you a little blurb on the syntax intensives we're doing too, if you'd like more on this.
And there will be a recording that we'll send out. We have two separate, companies. So we'll both send you out stuff on an email blast, but you can always unsubscribe if you never want to hear from either one of us again.
Absolutely. I think some of you are probably already on our list. Right, exactly. Probably some of you are already on our list, but yeah, so this is great. Thanks so much, Jennifer, for having me.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for giving up your evenings.